Welcome one, welcome all, to the first episode of the Museum Mascots series here on the Saurian Savant. And in today's episode, we will be exploring the topic of what I like to call the industrial dinosaur, otherwise known as Carnegie's Diplodocus. So, our story begins in the 1890s, except that it really doesn't. In reality, of course, our story starts about 150 million years earlier than that, in the late Jurassic period, where a pair of dinosaurs that we would refer to today as Diplodocus lived their lives unceremoniously before eventually dying of uncertain causes, one after the other, in the vicinity of what a gang of hairless apes of questionable intelligence would refer to more than 100 million years later as Sheep Creek in Albany County, Wyoming. And so, our twin heroes, having thus died unceremoniously after having accomplished perhaps something throughout their lives, though it is, of course, impossible to say at this point, as you might imagine, they don't exactly have much to contribute to the proceedings. And indeed they won't for more than 100 million years. So let us leave them, and we will come back to them later, instead fast-forwarding about 149,999,975 years to the 1870s, though we do not stop here, in fact, to meet with Carnegie. At this point in time, Carnegie was busy building his steel empire out of Pittsburgh. The word dinosaur might as well have been a figment of his imagination for all he cared. And certainly he was not interested in the scientific study or acquisition of such magnificent animals. Not then, at least. No, instead we stop in the 1870s to meet with these two. Well, I would call them fine gentlemen, except they really weren't fine at all, nor were they much in the way of gentlemen. If you've ever studied paleontology in any capacity, or you've ever picked up a dinosaur book that has gone into any sort of detail on the history of discoveries of dinosaurs, you probably have a very good idea who these two individuals are. But if you have not, the man on the left is Othniel Charles Marsh of Yale University in New Haven, Connecticut, and the man on the right is Edward Drinker Cope, whose academic career was somewhat less stable than Marsh's, and who thus pinballed around for some time, before eventually settling at the University of Pennsylvania in Philadelphia, Pennsylvania. Now, of course, the reason we are stopping at these two, and the reason we are exploring their role in the history of Carnegie's Diplodocus, is because of what can generously be described as the most ludicrously unprofessional professional rivalry possibly in the entire history of science. And that, of course, would be what we now know today as the Bone Wars. A thoroughly ridiculous clash of egos that ended up escalating to such ludicrous degrees, so much so that Marsh and Cope, or more accurately, Marsh and Cope's dig teams, would end up blowing up their rivals' dig sites, and even blowing up their own dig sites, after they were done excavating from them, to prevent their rivals from excavating fossils there afterwards. And the reason Marsh and Cope were so desperate about this, and the reason they resorted to such ludicrously extreme measures, was because they were both desperate in what can only be described as a ridiculously childish fit of ego. They were inordinately desperate to name the most new species and publish the most new scientific papers. And more in particular, to publish more scientific papers and describe more new species than their rival. A pursuit, it should be mentioned, that eventually led both men to complete financial ruin, because taking any such practice to the extreme will lead to destructive consequences. Now, the Bone Wars in themselves could form the topic of an entirely separate video, so for that reason we actually won't spend too much time here. And in fact, the reason we are stopping on the Bone Wars is to look at, in particular, two genera of dinosaurs that were described as a result of the Bone Wars rivalry. As you may have guessed by now, one of them was Diplodocus. The other was this creature, Brontosaurus. Or is it Apatosaurus? That itself is also a topic for a future video. Now, the original Diplodocus fossils, or what in scientific parlance would be described as the holotype, were extremely incomplete. In fact, the original Diplodocus holotype consisted of all of 4 tail vertebrae. And as you might imagine, this wasn't exactly much to go on when attempting to describe a new species, and, more in particular, to figure out exactly what the thing looked like in life. However, the holotype of Brontosaurus, or is it Apatosaurus, was much more complete. Complete enough, in fact, that Marsh was able to commission this illustration, which was originally published in 1883, and then was eventually republished with edits in 1896, of the skeleton of Brontosaurus, or is it Apatosaurus, which was effectively the first reasonably complete reconstruction of a sauropod dinosaur. Now, the holotype of Brontosaurus, or is it Apatosaurus, was not in fact found or discovered by Marsh himself. In fact, both Cope and Marsh by the 1870s really didn't bother going out into the field. They were both far too busy holed up in their offices in Philadelphia and New Haven, feverishly describing the literal trainloads of new specimens that were coming their way from the collectors they had employed for them to go scour the western Badlands for fossils for them. And the person who discovered the holotype of Brontosaurus, or is it Apatosaurus, was this man. This is William Harlow Reed. And Reed was one of the many, many people Marsh employed as a collector to go out and find fossils for him. Now, it should be mentioned that Reed, unlike Marsh, was no scientist. He really didn't have much of a care for the scientific value of any of the fossils he collected. His interests were purely and very explicitly pecuniary in nature. Reed was very definitely only interested in how much money he could earn by selling the fossils that he collected. However, despite this, Reed was actually a reasonably successful fossil collector for Marsh. In addition to finding the holotype of Brontosaurus, or is it Apatosaurus, he found several other notable fossils throughout the late 1870s and the early 1880s. However, the sheer lunacy that was beginning to transpire about the Bone Wars, and the ridiculous lengths to which both Marsh and Cope exhorted their employed collectors to go to ensure their patrons' eventual victory over their rival, the sort of feverish, utterly insane atmosphere, it eventually drove Reed out of the field. He eventually expressed the desire to quit fossil collecting altogether, and in fact, in 1883, he did exactly that by retiring from Marsh's employ and starting a sheep ranch, even purchasing some sheep with the intention of raising them himself. However, unfortunately for Reed, all of his sheep died within the next 2 years, and thus back into fossil collecting it was. Now, originally Reed went back to Marsh because Marsh was the one who had initially employed him, and thus there was still some element of a relationship there, although it had been soured somewhat by Reed leaving Marsh a few years previously. However, when Reed went back to Marsh, he once again grew frustrated at a problem that had already existed even before he left for his sheep ranch, which is namely that Marsh was infamously miserly. He was notoriously lackadaisical about actually paying the collectors that he was employing to collect fossils for him. And as you might imagine, this led Reed to pursue, shall we say, a more stable form of employment. And fortunately for Reed, a more stable form of employment he did eventually find at the University of Wyoming. However, ironically enough, Apparently this wasn't actually good enough for Reed, because he continued to collect for Marsh, apparently as a way to earn some extra money on the side, even while he was employed in Wyoming. And the University of Wyoming wasn't terribly happy with him about this. And indeed, this disagreement between Reed and the university eventually led them to fire him in the late 1890s. However, at some point during the 1890s, perhaps during Reed's tenure as a professor at the University of Wyoming, or perhaps after he was fired, I'm not entirely certain, he found quite the impressive specimen. And that leads us, at long last, to Andrew Carnegie. Yeah, so you were wondering how he would figure into the story. Well, it is now the 1890s. Carnegie has finished building his steel empire out of Pittsburgh. And at this point, he's wondering what to do with all of his ill-gotten millions. And one of the ideas Carnegie hit upon, because it should be mentioned that despite being, the 1890s equivalent of a modern billionaire, with all of the, shall we say, character shortcomings that come associated with that, Carnegie always wanted to at least appear as a benevolent patron of the fine arts and of knowledge of all descriptions. He wanted to present himself as, the most enlightened man in the world, effectively. And one of the things he wanted to finance was this: the Carnegie Museum. There were several facets to the Carnegie Museum, but the one we care about for our purposes is the Carnegie Museum of Natural History, which was a facility Carnegie founded essentially to serve two purposes, both to educate the public about the natural world, because it does seem that Carnegie was genuine in his desire to do this, but also to stroke his own ego. Because after all, not everyone in the United States, or indeed anywhere else in the world, could just casually put up a natural history museum and fill it with incredible specimens at the drop of a hat. And thus, for this reason, Carnegie established his Carnegie Museum, which came into existence in 1896. However, as you might imagine, it is all very well and good creating a museum, but filling it with specimens is another question entirely. At the time of its birth, the Carnegie Museum did not in fact have much of anything in the way of collections, and certainly nothing show-stopping that would bring visitors flocking in from far and wide to visit the museum and effectively pay their tribute to Andrew Carnegie. And of course, Carnegie could not have that. And so he was casting about for particularly impressive things that he could display in his museum when he came across this article, which was published in the now defunct journal, the New York Journal and Advertiser, on December 11th, 1898, where they describe the most colossal animal ever on Earth just found out west, which was in reference to a femur or thigh bone of a sauropod that was discovered by William Harlow Reed. And thus we see the connection between Reed and Carnegie. Now, as you might imagine, this article was hopelessly inaccurate in several important details. For example, they refer to the discoverer of this mysterious femur as Professor W.H. Reeder of the University of Wyoming. Apparently, Reed was not impressive enough for the people at the journal, and thus they had to make him a little Reeder, if you would. One can only imagine what Reed thought of that when he saw it. However, that is a relatively minor inaccuracy. There are several far more major ones that are also found in this article. For example, they describe the creature that this femur belongs to as its length from head to tail in life must have been 180 feet, and its weight 120,000 pounds. Now, anyone who knows anything about dinosaurs would be able to tell you that Brontosaurus, or is it Apatosaurus, did not come even remotely close to either of those dimensions in life, being more accurately about 80 or 90 feet long, and about, perhaps, 60,000 pounds, or 30 tons. But of course, this was emblematic of the classic sensationalist exaggeration that so thoroughly afflicted every major newspaper of the era. However, this is not the worst inaccuracy of this article. That would be found on the other side, namely with this image and its caption. Skull of the Brontosaurus in Wyoming, it says. Once again, anyone who knows anything about dinosaurs will be able to tell you at the drop of a hat that this skull really could not have much less to do with Brontosaurus, or is it a Apatosaurus? This is in fact the skull of Ceratosaurus nasicornis, a meat-eating theropod dinosaur, and the only connection whatsoever that Ceratosaurus has to Brontosaurus is that Ceratosaurus lived in about the same place at about the same time. Incidentally, they do refer to Ceratosaurus by name in the text of the article, so the explanation I can come up with for this error is that whoever was putting the layout of the article together and writing the captions for the figures seems to have gotten their wires crossed and believed that this skull was referring to the most colossal animal ever on Earth just found out west, rather than the Ceratosaurus that was really only mentioned offhand in the article itself. However, inaccurate though it was, sensationalist though it was, this article caused quite a splash on the East Coast when it actually came out, and it attracted the eyes of several noteworthy industry tycoons and bigwigs, not least of whom, of course, was none other than Andrew Carnegie. Carnegie was taken by the concept of a creature so colossal that it could in fact rear up upon its hind limbs and peer into the window of the top floor window of a 10-story building, and thus he contracted this man to try and find one. This is William Holland, and he was the very first director of the Carnegie Museum. And as you can see here, in December 1898, Carnegie sent Holland a clipping of a different newspaper article, which actually appeared in the New York Post on December 1st, 1898, with a handwritten note scrawled in the margin. Now, if you cannot read it, this is what it says. It reads, "My Lord," which refers to Holland. For whatever reason, Carnegie and Holland seem to like referring to each other with noble titles, which is a bit of a strange tendency considering neither of them were any kind of nobility whatsoever, and which seems to have been effectively just a point of ego stroking for them both. I really can't explain this. But, moving on. "My Lord, can't you buy this for Pittsburgh? Try. Wyoming State University isn't rich. Get an offer. Hurry. A.C." And thus the race was on. Because, it should be remembered, Carnegie was not the only person to have seen these articles coming out about these colossal and impressive dinosaurs that were being discovered out west in the 1890s. And Carnegie, along with all the other industrial bigwigs of the era, wanted to be the first one to be able to procure and mount one of these impressive dinosaurs for display. And thus, he contracted Holland, who then assembled a team and took it out west to Wyoming in an effort to find Reed, who was the discoverer of this impressive find, and see if they could purchase the discovery that Reed had made. What apparently wasn't terribly clear to the Carnegie team until they actually met Reed in Wyoming was that the thing Reed had found was just a femur, which is impressive enough, but doesn't exactly have a huge amount of presence on its own in a museum hall. And Carnegie wanted better than that. Carnegie, in fact, wanted a full skeleton, or at least as full a skeleton as they could feasibly find. And so for this reason, the Carnegie crew initially actually attempted to go back to the site where Reed had initially discovered his Brontosaurus femur, or is it a Apatosaurus? However, as Reed himself had probably told them before they went there, they didn't exactly meet with much in the way of success. It seems that apparently that quarry, such as it was, had ran itself dry because the only sauropod material they were able to find there was the original femur that Reed himself had discovered. At this point, Holland was a bit despondent because he desperately wanted to furnish his patron with an impressive skeleton that he could use to populate his grand display halls, and this was a goal that at that point seemed functionally unrealizable. However, Reed then made the offer to take the Carnegie crew to another quarry that he figured might produce better results. And this quarry should perhaps look a little familiar because it is in the vicinity of Sheep Creek in Albany County, Wyoming. And so the Carnegie crew went there in spring and summer 1899, and in doing so, they struck gold. Or more accurately, they struck a toe bone that led to the discovery of not one, but two fantastically complete dinosaur skeletons. And so, overjoyed at their success, the Carnegie crew excavated as many bones as they could reasonably remove from the earth in a single field season and shipped them back east to Pittsburgh. And then in the following year, they returned to the site to finish quarrying out the rest of the skeletons. Now, in addition to actually mounting the things, if they wanted to be proper scientists, they would also want to describe them. And the duty for that fell to this man. This is John Bell Hatcher. Ironically enough, Hatcher was actually also one of Marsh's erstwhile collectors. However, Hatcher was just as unsatisfied as Reed about Marsh's miserly character, and eventually he ended up leaving Marsh and finding more permanent employment at the Carnegie Museum. One of his first projects there was, in fact, excavating and then later describing these two massive Diplodocus skeletons, and indeed, as early as 1901, Hatcher was able to publish a monograph describing the find, including this image, which, it should be mentioned, seems to be the very first quarry map that has ever been published accompanying a scientific monograph of fossil specimens. Now, the caption for this image I found inordinately difficult to parse, but as far as I can tell, the skeleton in the center left there is CM84, which is the majority of the skeleton of the new Diplodocus, and the bit to the top right is CM94, which is the other individual of Diplodocus that was discovered near the same area. Now, it should be mentioned here that in addition to the two Diplodocus skeletons, the Carnegie crew also found bits and pieces of various other dinosaurs in the vicinity, such as Stegosaurus and Camarasaurus, and a couple of other things. However, the real stars of the show were the two Diplodocus skeletons. And indeed, both of them combined were complete enough that in 1901, Hatcher was able to determine that he was looking at a new species. These two Diplodocus skeletons did not belong to any species of Diplodocus that had been described previously, at least according to Hatcher's estimation anyway, and thus he decided to give them the name of Diplodocus carnegii, in honor of his patron. And in addition to the new name, for his monograph, Hatcher was also able to commission a full-body illustration of the thing, which you can see right here. And this was effectively a prototype for what was intended to be the mounting of the skeleton later on. And in fact, I was able to find this image showing exactly which bits of both skeletons were used in the eventual mount. In green here, you can see CM84, which is designated the holotype of Diplodocus carnegii. This skeleton defines what Diplodocus carnegii is, in other words. And then the bits in yellow are CM94, which was the other skeleton that was discovered at the site. And the bits in gray were various bits that were not found with either skeleton and thus had to be cast from other specimens of Diplodocus, most notably including the skull. However, the Carnegie crew ran into problems when attempting to mount their skeleton, and this leads us to a clash of egos. You see, as I mentioned previously, the Carnegie crew was not the only crew that was in a desperate rush to find, mount, and display an impressive sauropod for their new museum. As a matter of fact, there were several, shall we say, new blood museums that sprang into existence in the latter half of the 19th century, and that were all desperate for grand skeletons and other impressive displays to populate their hitherto empty halls. And in this case in particular, the Carnegie crew's main competition was the American Museum of Natural History in New York and the Field Museum of Natural History in Chicago. And thus that leads us to our first pop quiz. Which museum do you think was the first to successfully mount and display a sauropod? Was it the Carnegie Museum? Was it the American Museum of Natural History? Was it the Field Museum? Or was it somewhere else entirely? Leave your answers in the comments below before you hear the actual answer. I'll give you a second to think about it and make your guess. All right, you've had your chance to think about it. The correct answer is the American Museum of Natural History in New York, which on February 16th, 1905, unveiled this skeleton of a composite Brontosaurus. Or is it a Apatosaurus? Now you may be wondering at this point, well, hold on. If the Carnegie crew was able to describe their Diplodocus as early as 1901, or in other words, if they'd managed to quarry out all of the bones that they intended to use for their mount of their new Diplodocus as early as 1901 to give Hatcher the chance to describe it, why in the world do they still not have the thing mounted 4 years later when the AM&H put up this mount of their Brontosaurus? Or is it a Apatosaurus? And the answer to that lies in the fact that the Carnegie crew had a significant spatial problem with their museum. You see, the image I showed you earlier of the Carnegie Museum is the Carnegie Museum as it exists today. However, this was not the building that the Carnegie Museum was established in 1896. And in fact, the old Carnegie Museum building was too small to effectively house and display a skeleton as massive as a Diplodocus, which meant that they had to construct a new one. Something they had not finished doing when AM&H put up their skeleton of the Brontosaurus. And so that brings us to the end of our story. Carnegie made a valiant effort to be the first to display a massive sauropod skeleton, but in the end he was beaten out by his rivals in New York, who were bankrolling the American Museum of Natural History. Carnegie could perhaps console himself with the cold comfort that he was technically the first to display a sauropod of some kind, thanks to having put up a temporary mount of the Diplodocus in the Western Pennsylvania Exposition Hall in Pittsburgh in 1904, but this was explicitly a temporary mount, and I'm not convinced it actually had any original fossil material. And so there our story ends. Right? I had you there for a second, didn't I? Ha! Of course not. We're only just getting started with this thing. Carnegie was an egotist. He would never have simply rolled over and accepted defeat against his rivals. He wanted to expand his brand and prove himself the most impressive figure of his era. And fortunately for him, an opportunity to do just that had already landed in his lap, and he was in the middle of exploiting it when the American Museum of Natural History mounted their composite Brontosaurus, or is it a Apatosaurus, in February of 1905. And so, to continue our tale, we actually must step back a year earlier to meet this man. This somewhat demented individual is King Edward VII of the United Kingdom, and in 1904, King Edward was busy making a tour of the various royal castles around the UK. It seems that apparently he was interested in renovating the plumbing on all of these various castles. And one of the places he visited during this royal tour was this place. This is Skibo Castle in the Scottish Highlands, and in 1904 it was under the ownership of none other than our old friend Andrew Carnegie, who, it should be mentioned, was actually of Scottish origin. So in some sense, Carnegie acquiring Skibo Castle was him returning to his homeland. Now, the reason Edward wanted to visit Carnegie in his castle was because Carnegie had recently renovated the plumbing in his castle, and Edward wanted to take inspiration. And in fact, Edward's arrival at Skibo Castle was apparently so abrupt, and so unannounced, if you would, that it caused something of a problem for the castle staff at the time. You see, by tradition, anywhere the king goes in the UK, and possibly elsewhere, but as I understand it, certainly in the UK, it is tradition for God Save the King to be played ahead of his arrival. However, Edward's arrival at Skibo Castle in 1904 was so sudden that in order to play God Save the King in time for his arrival, the castle staff actually had to drag the organ player out of the bath he was taking to get him to play God Save the King in time. As one of those funny historical coincidences, shall we say. However, we aren't here to labor long over the King Edward's love affair with his castle's plumbing. And of course, as you might imagine, that was not the only thing Edward did while he was at Skibo Castle. And for our purposes, the important thing is that when Edward was at Skibo Castle, he saw this, or something like it. Namely, a reconstruction of Carnegie's famous Diplodocus, though it wasn't famous yet at the time. And of course, as you might imagine, the king was instantly taken in by just how enormous and just how alien a creature this thing was, and thus he had to ask Carnegie what in the world he was looking at. To which Carnegie, of course, could not resist the chance to peddle his ego even further by describing it as Diplodocus carnegii, a massive 90-foot-long dinosaur that was named after him. Edward, being suitably impressed with the thing, replied with, "Well then, we absolutely must have it for the British Museum." And Carnegie, the shrewd businessman that he was, could recognize an opportunity as well as anyone, and promised that one would be delivered to the British Museum in short order, and Carnegie wired Holland with instructions to the same effect. Now, initially, Carnegie wanted Holland to find and present a completely new original skeleton of Diplodocus to the British Museum for King Edward. However, Holland made the astute observation that they had already had some difficulty finding the skeletons that they had, and there was no guarantee that any kind of Carnegie crew would be able to find a new, reasonably complete skeleton of a sauropod in the desired time frame to present it to King Edward and the British Museum. Instead, suggested Holland, perhaps the British could be plied with a replica skeleton. Perhaps instead of trying to find a completely new skeleton, they can make a plaster copy of the one they already had and present that to London. And seeing the wisdom in such a course of action, Carnegie agreed and signed off on the plan to create plaster skeletons to be shipped off to London. Now, had Holland known exactly what he was asking of his army of plaster reconstructionists, perhaps he might have reconsidered going out into the field and searching for a new skeleton, but by then the die had been cast. Or perhaps more accurately, the bones had been cast. As again, thus, the Carnegie crew worked at a prodigious rate, it should be mentioned, because a scant year later, the bones were ready to arrive in London, and the skeleton was unveiled in London not even a scant 3 months after the unveiling of the composite Brontosaurus, or is it Apatosaurus, at the American Museum of Natural History, the skeleton being unveiled in London on May 12th, 1905, which, ironically enough, was actually ahead of the unveiling of the original skeleton back in Pittsburgh. Now, when the Carnegie Diplodocus was unveiled in London, it was met with near universal acclaim. Throngs of people flocked to London and to the Natural History Museum to see this grand new skeleton, which was both larger and more complete than any dinosaurs that had yet been discovered from the UK itself. Now, to be clear, the British Museum-going public was by no means unfamiliar with the concept of a dinosaur. After all, the first dinosaurs that had ever been recognized as dinosaurs were first discovered and described in the UK. And the word dinosaur itself was coined by an Englishman, namely Sir Richard Owen. However, none of the dinosaurs that had yet been found on British shores were nearly as complete or as large as Carnegie's Diplodocus. And primarily for that reason, the new sauropod skeleton was an instant hit among the public. However, it did not quite meet with universal acclaim. Ironically enough, King Edward himself was not actually there to see the unveiling of the Diplodocus, even though he was the one who asked for it, instead sending a representative to oversee the thing for him. Apparently, upon being asked why the king was not there to see the unveiling of the skeleton that he asked for, the representative replied with something to the effect of, "You may as well ask the Diplodocus because it knows about as much on the subject as I do." However, some other individuals were, shall we say, more direct in their dissent about the arrival of this colossal new skeleton. One of the most obvious notes of dissent came from the then director of the British Museum, a man named E. Ray Lancaster. And Lancaster was of the opinion, and to be completely honest, I really can't fault him for this, but he was of the opinion that there was no real reason to display a plaster copy of an American dinosaur when the British Museum already had within its collections several perfectly good British dinosaurs, which, it should be mentioned, were composed of original fossil material. However, on this front, Lancaster was to stand more or less alone. The British Museum-going public certainly didn't seem to care very much, because visitations spiked following the arrival of the plaster Diplodocus, and indeed, the new skeleton attracted so much attention that it began to receive flattering depictions in the pages of the local cartoon agencies. For example, these two cartoons, the left from Sketch and the right from Punch magazines. However, this is where our old friends at the American Museum of Natural History swan dive their way into the fray yet again. For you see, certainly the American Museum of Natural History had attracted some noticeable headlines when they first unveiled their composite Brontosaurus, or is it Apatosaurus, in February of 1905, but since then, all eyes were on Carnegie and his impressive Diplodocus, which was attracting all of the media attention, certainly in the UK, and its influence was beginning to spread beyond that. Indeed, the unveiling of the London Diplodocus was so impressive that Carnegie, in the subsequent years, began to accrue requests from other major heads of state to see if perhaps he could not furnish similar casts of his Diplodocus to be sent to their home institutions as well. It is also important to mention in the middle of this that the original fossils finally went up on display at the Carnegie Museum in 1907. Now, of course, let us not forget that the American Museum of Natural History was being bankrolled by the exact same sort of egotistic bigwigs as Carnegie himself. And they were not about to simply cede the international stage to Carnegie simply because Carnegie was able to crank out copies of his major discovery. And so, to that end, to preempt an effort of Carnegie's to install a Diplodocus in Germany, with a cast of the Carnegie Diplodocus that was intended for Berlin, the American Museum of Natural History decided to send this skeleton, which they had in their collections, and which ended up in the Senckenberg Museum in Frankfurt, thanks to a long-standing friendship between the director of the Senckenberg Museum and the director of the American Museum of Natural History. Now, there were several important differences between the AMNH Diplodocus that ended up in Frankfurt and the Carnegie cast that was intended for Berlin. Firstly, the AMNH Diplodocus was not the same species as the Carnegie one. The AMNH Diplodocus was judged to belong to the species Diplodocus longus, although the difference between that and Diplodocus carnegii is, by modern standards, relatively nebulous. But, more importantly, The AMNH Diplodocus, unlike the Carnegie one, was in fact composed at least partially of original fossil material, and more importantly, it arrived in Germany first. And that meant that all of the German museum-going public, who were desperate to see the grandest and newest impressive specimens in their natural history museums, naturally gravitated to Frankfurt instead of Berlin, because Frankfurt was where they could go to see the new sauropod. And for that reason, when the Carnegie Diplodocus cast finally arrived in Berlin, it didn't seem to make very much in the way of local headlines. After all, any German museum goers who wanted to see a sauropod could long since have done so by going to Frankfurt. And thus, the arrival of the Carnegie Diplodocus was met with little more than a shrug of the shoulders on the part of a great deal of the German public. However, Berlin was not the only intended destination to which Carnegie wanted to send more casts of his dinosaur. He also sent one to Paris at about the same time. And unlike in Berlin, the Paris cast met much the same reception as the London one, with wild success, enormous crowds, and throngs of Frenchmen who were desperate to see such an impressive new dinosaur, the likes of which had never been witnessed anywhere in France before. And, much the same way as in London, several local magazines and newspapers began to print cartoons lampooning the thing and frequently comparing it to local contemporary politicians, as was the wont of many Parisian newspapers. Now, it is important to mention at this point that the proliferation of all of these casts of the Carnegie Diplodocus meant that for the first time in paleontological history, something unique could happen. Namely, that the proliferation of all of these casts across the world meant that researchers of all sorts of different stripes could study the exact same bones. And, as you might imagine, this soon led to disagreement. Though ironically enough, the first note of dissent came not from anyone in Europe, but instead from an American. And, even more ironically, an American under Carnegie's own employ. Namely this man. This is Oliver Perry Hay. And Hay was a paleontologist under Carnegie's employ at the Carnegie Institute in Washington, D.C. In 1908, Hay penned an article that questioned the accuracy of Hatcher and Holland's mounting efforts, and more specifically of the pose they selected for the limbs of their Diplodocus. Hay was of the opinion that they had reconstructed the skeleton in a pose that was slightly too mammalian to be realistic for a reptile, and thus he thought that it would be more accurate, and in his words, no less impressive, to remount the skeleton with the limbs in a more characteristically lizard-like pose. Now, Hay at least was relatively conciliatory in his arguments towards Hatcher and especially Holland. It should be mentioned, by the way, that Hatcher had already passed away at this point of typhoid in 1904. Hay at least was relatively conciliatory. The same cannot be said for the next person to argue for the same cause, namely this man. This is Gustav Tournier. And Tournier was a German zoologist and herpetologist who worked in Berlin, and who, when he saw the Berlin copy of the Carnegie Diplodocus, almost immediately came to the same conclusions as Hay did. However, unlike Hay, Tournier was much less forgiving of what he perceived to be the Americans' errors. And he made his opinions very clearly known in a publication that he released into the world in 1909. Now, unfortunately, I have not been able to find an original copy of this manuscript, so I have not been able to translate it for myself. The most I've been able to find is the following quote, which was translated by Dutch historian Ilya Newland. That the Diplodocus must have been able to raise his neck vertically is something Mr. Holland already assumed. The reason why the present position was chosen for the restoration was to make the skull and neck vertebrae more visible to the visitor. which I am forced to conclude is Tournier making the insinuation that the only reason the Carnegie crew mounted their Diplodocus in the way that they did was to make the thing look as impressive as possible to visitors, so they would pay more money to see it. Which should give you some indication of just how low Tournier's regard was for the Carnegie crew. So, you may be asking, if Tournier thought the Carnegie crew's efforts were as utterly worthless as that, what in the world did he think was the correct way to mount a sauropod? Well, before we answer that question, I am obliged to provide you here with a content warning, because the following imagery may be considered disturbing for younger viewers. For you see, Tournier was of the opinion that the correct way to mount a sauropod was like this. Dear God, what is that? What is this utter monstrosity, and how in the world did he come up with this? This is something we probably will never know, nor will we ever particularly want to know. Nevertheless, this was Tournier's opinion as to the correct way to mount a sauropod. And let us not forget that Tournier utterly lambasted Holland for daring to think otherwise. Now, as you might imagine, to Holland this was an insult that could not be borne. And bear it he did not. Because in 1910, Holland rebutted Tournier's argument with what has to be, in my opinion, the single funniest piece of scientific writing I have ever seen. Now, I could never do Holland justice by attempting to summarize him in my own words, and for that reason I will not try. Instead, it will be my distinct pleasure to quote relevant excerpts from the paper in question to you. In the matter of a man who has made a wonderful discovery, Tournier announces at the outset of his paper that Diplodocus is a genuine reptile, ein echtes Reptil. No student of the Sauropoda has ever doubted this, but having predicated the genuinely reptilian character of the animal, Tournier proceeds thereafter to speak of the Diplodocus as a Lacertilian, ein Eidechse. There are reptiles and reptiles. Having assured himself of the truly reptilian character of the animal, it was a bold step for him immediately to transfer the creature from the order Dinosauria, and, evidently with the skeleton of a Varanus and a chameleon before him, to proceed with the help of a pencil, the powerful tool of the closet naturalist, to reconstruct the skeleton, upon the study of which 2 generations of American paleontologists have expended considerable time and labor, and squeeze the animal into the form which his brilliantly illuminated imagination suggested. The fact that the Dinosauria differ radically from existing reptiles in a multitude of important structural points seems not to have greatly impressed itself upon the mind of this astute critic. He intimates that the pelvis of Diplodocus is distinctly Lacertilian. He states that the great trochanter of the femur, which he does not designate as such, articulated with the ischial peduncle, and takes care to show the point of union by means of a lettered diagram, which I herewith reproduce. He takes pains to show that E, the great trochanter, articulates with C, the ischial peduncle. It may be said in passing that Dr. Tournier takes very great liberties with the outlines of the bones. His drawing is very far from accurate. Unfortunately, actual experiment shows first that it is impossible, except by smashing the ilium or breaking the femur, to jam the head of the latter into the position demanded for it by the learned professor. But second, this is the only time it is believed in the history of anatomical science that anyone has discovered that the great trochanter of the femur ought to be, and is by nature intended to be, articulated with the ischial peduncle of the ilium, thus locking the femur into a position utterly precluding all motion whatsoever. Like I said, this is truly the greatest piece of scientific writing I have ever seen. I'll read another excerpt, skipping ahead a bit. But let us, for the sake of experiment, give the femur the same relative position which it has in the lacertilia, in which the second trochanter plays so great a part. To do this, it is necessary to rotate the head of the femur in such a way that the great trochanter will point downward and backward. The accompanying diagrammatic illustration shows the femur of the Diplodocus adapted to the acetabulum after the analogy of Varanus and iguana. Of what earthly use the hindom of the Diplodocus could have been to him in such a position, I leave you to determine for yourselves. It has been suggested that kindly nature, to meet the requirements of the case, must have channeled the surface of the earth, and provided the Diplodocus and its allies with troughs in which they kept their bodies, while the feet were employed for purposes of locomotion along the banks. The Diplodocus must have moved in a groove or a rut. This might perhaps account for his early extinction. It is physically and mentally bad to get into a rut. Now, as you might have guessed, such a thorough excoriation of Tournier's arguments did in fact lead Tournier to simply duck out of the issue altogether, following the publication of Holland's article, which, as I mentioned, appeared in 1910. However, events had progressed past the point where scientific arguments really mattered. And by the early 1910s, Kaiser Wilhelm II met with Tournier, and possibly a couple of others, to discuss whether the Berlin Diplodocus, and possibly the Frankfurt one as well, could be remounted in a more German fashion. As far as I can tell, nothing particularly came of this. I don't know if either skeleton were themselves remounted in such a way. The best I've been able to find is this image, which depicts a model made for the Senckenberg Museum, showing the Diplodocus with, shall we say, more sprawled limbs than is entirely understood as accurate nowadays. However, they deliberately obfuscated whether Diplodocus habitually walked with legs directly underneath it or sprawled out to the side by depicting these Diplodocus as swimming in the water. It should be mentioned that a big part of the reason why they never seem to have bothered with remounting the Diplodocus and their Diplodocus skeletons in such a way is because by the time of 1911 or 1912, German paleontologists were, by that point, very, very heavily invested in a completely different paleontological project, namely the excavation of the Tendaguru field sites in Tanzania, which produced something that, to Germany, was far more impressive than any cast Diplodocus, and which they eventually ended up mounting some 15 or 20 years later in Berlin, namely the famous Berlin Giraffatitan, or Brachiosaurus as it was then known. And yet, the Brachiosaurus, or again, Giraffatitan as it is nowadays, actually looks eminently normal. Which is actually kind of a shame, because I would have loved to see this thing mounted Tournier style. However, it is clear as well that the German scientists were not the only ones who were, shall we say, skeptical of Holland's mounting efforts. Witness this monstrosity. In case you cannot read the signs, these are in Cyrillic. This is the St. Petersburg Diplodocus. And at some point after Holland was finished mounting the thing, which I believe was completed in 1912, someone at the St. Petersburg Museum remounted their Diplodocus with this utterly ridiculous bow-legged front feet. Now, unfortunately for the life of me, I have not been able to figure out who asked for this, why they asked for this, when they asked for this, or when they changed it, because this Diplodocus does not look like this nowadays. However, this picture makes it indisputable that at some point, someone in the St. Petersburg Museum thought this would be the accurate way to mount a sauropod. and thus we can all point and laugh at them, because who in the world would think this could possibly be accurate? Now, as you can see from this image, Carnegie kept on receiving request after request to continue to produce more and more casts of his famous Diplodocus. And the flags here represent exactly where he sent all of the things by the time he was done making them. As you can see, there's one in Pittsburgh itself, the original skeleton, and then there's the ones in London, France, Paris, and Berlin. But in addition to that, there's also the St. Petersburg one, but there was also one that was sent to Vienna, Austria. I believe this is Bologna in Italy. There's one requested for Madrid in Spain, as well as one requested for Uruguay and Mexico City. And part of the reason Carnegie wanted to send all of these casts to as many different places as he possibly could was, ironically enough, it seems to have been part of what ended up being a very misguided attempt at diplomacy. Essentially, Carnegie could see which way the wind was blowing in the early 20th century, and he could tell as well as anyone that all of the major powers of the world were gearing up for what would end up being an absolutely enormous war. And Carnegie, as was his wont, thought that he alone could stop it. After all, he was desirous of world peace, perhaps more than the average industrialist of his era. And part of his scheme was, in fact, to proliferate these casts of the Diplodocus across various nations throughout the world, perhaps as an effort to remind people that they all live on the same planet and they could all see the same animals. As you might imagine, this effort failed miserably, and in 1914, armies of Germany, France, the United Kingdom, Austria-Hungary, Russia, and various others all marched off to war in what would later become known as World War I. And yet, believe it or not, even here, Diplodocus still managed to leave its mark. You see, as any student of World War I is likely to know, World War I was utterly brutal in a way you can make the argument no war had ever been previously. Because technology had advanced far, far past the doctrines that were being adhered to by the then current army commanders, which inevitably led to the wholesale massacre of millions upon millions of soldiers across battlefields on both the Western and Eastern fronts. It's from 1914 to 1918. And faced with the sheer unrelenting carnage of the war, military commanders were understandably desperate to find anything they could possibly use to completely turn the tide and ensure a decisive victory before they continued to lose any more soldiers and potentially face mutinies by the ones they still had. And one of the more successful experiments they came up with were things like this and this. These were some of the very first tanks. Self-propelled, armored pillboxes, effectively, with guns sticking out the front, that could ideally shield the men inside from all of the small arms fire, such as the machine guns that had utterly decimated the infantry in the years leading up to the deployment of the things, while potentially allowing breakthroughs of enemy trenches that could then be exploited by the infantry behind them. Now, the early tanks were, as you might imagine, extremely crude instruments. They were very mechanically unreliable, the guns were of questionable utility at best, none of the components were necessarily designed to work well together, and they were supremely uncomfortable to operate for the men inside them. Now, apparently, at least some of these qualities brought to mind something else in the minds of the people who witnessed them. For you see, apparently, soldiers in World War I thought these things were equivalent to this. What? This one I blame on the PTSD. However, what is undeniable is the fact that there are several documents from the World War I era that do in fact describe soldiers referring to these early tanks as Diplodocuses. And in fact, this was one of the few terms that consistently carried over well between soldiers of different armies speaking different languages. After all, let us not forget that the casts of the Carnegie Diplodocus were proliferated all across Europe. And so soldiers from Britain, soldiers from France, soldiers from Germany or Austria or Italy or any number of other places were at least reasonably likely to know of Diplodocus, of what it was and what it was perceived to be, namely as a simple lumbering monster, and thus it would be one of the first things that would come to mind for just about any soldier in World War I, especially upon witnessing certain machines, such as these tanks, that in at least some ways were broadly similar. And so, once again, Carnegie's Diplodocus continues to leave its mark on world history. Now, after World War I, the proliferation of the Carnegie casts quieted. After all, Carnegie himself died in 1919, and with him went most of his fortune, since he was determined on giving most of it away during his lifetime. However, a couple of casts were still made after Carnegie's death, the last of which was this one, which was actually requested by the Field House in Vernal, Utah in the 1970s, and thus they ended up actually casting this thing out of concrete rather than plaster. Initially, they decided to display the thing outside, but then later they moved it inside due to wear and tear of the elements. However, this is somehow still not the end of the drama surrounding the Carnegie Diplodocus and the various casts that it spawned. Specifically, in the early 2010s, the Natural History Museum in London ended up engendering quite the noticeable controversy when they elected to remove their cast Diplodocus from the main hall, called Hinsey Hall, which it had occupied since 1979. Now, the rationale the museum provided for this was that they wanted to replace this bygone symbol with something that was more societally relevant. And to that end, they decided to replace the Diplodocus skeleton with a skeleton of a blue whale named Hope, which they hung from the ceiling. Now, one could quibble over the efficacy of such a move, considering that the Natural History Museum in London already has a model of a blue whale on display elsewhere in the museum, but nevertheless, that is what they did. However, in the weeks before they finally moved the Diplodocus skeleton out of the main hall, there was an absolute outpouring of support from the British Museum going public, eventually engendering the hashtag of Save Dippy. So, what happened to the original skeleton, you may ask? Well, fear not, it is still on display to this day in the Carnegie Museum in Pittsburgh. As you can see, it has been remounted since its original mounting, as new research has shown, for example, that sauropods did not in fact drag their tails, but carried them well off the ground. But this is still the same original skeleton discovered by the Carnegie crews on July 4th, 1899. As you can see, in the current hall the Diplodocus occupies, it is in fact joined by its friend, which I'm naming Louise, which is the holotype skeleton of Apatosaurus louisei, which was another Carnegie find that came out of Dinosaur National Monuments in 1909. And so with that, I would like to thank you for your attention, and I hope this talk has been enjoyable for you, and I hope you learned something about the history of the most well-traveled dinosaur the world has ever seen. Thank you very much, and stay tuned for the next video.